The relationship between standards, curriculum, instruction, and assessment is one that can be confusing. And sometimes we end up talking about them in our buildings or with our faculty, and we use them interchangeably. So we want to take a moment to calibrate our language to make sure we're comfortable with what we're describing each piece of the standards, curriculum, instruction, and assessment, and how they work together. To do that, we want to work with an analogy, a building analogy. So standards. Standards are an area where we've made a commitment to consistency. I don't rewrite the standards. They are what they are. But we don't want to let them be more than they are. So for the analogy, standards are building codes. They are the minimum of what we expect. They are a target. And when we work with building codes, they're there for safety, for consistency, and we try to make sure our buildings meet code. So when we work with building codes are written by people, by professionals, and they have an identity of them. So our standards are written by people. They're not perfect, they don't know everything, but they have an identity and an agenda and a bias. So when we're working with standards, we want to create a tool called a year-long context. And what a year-long context does is it organizes the standards, creates bundles, sees connections within sets of standards that make sense. And we use tools like a year-long context to organize our alignment to them. Curriculum, on the other hand, is actually what happens in a given building. A curriculum would have the identity of an organization or a building or a classroom. So curriculum would have two tools. One is a curriculum map. So for our analogy, a curriculum map is like a blueprint. An architect might make a blueprint to show what the intended building would look like. Things about blueprints are, well, any architect can read a blueprint and understand the elements. In the same way, curriculum maps are consistent with their elements. Content are content, skills are skills. Any educator should be able to read a curriculum map and understand the intended curriculum, the plan, the cunning plan. But what can happen is if you and I both have the same blueprint, but you're building on granite and I'm building on sand, then the ultimate decisions about what we have to make could be different and result in a building that actually looks different. In the same way, two teachers can have the same curriculum map, but depending on the students they have in the classroom, what's happening in the classroom, if anyone's ever taught in a building while it was under construction, you know what I'm saying. Curriculums in a given year, the operational curriculum, can result in very different curriculum experiences. A good example might be in an election year. The curriculum for the social studies teachers very often is different in an election year than what might happen in an off year. So these are the kinds of things that impact the relationship between the curriculum map and then the actual operational curriculum. When I'm working with a building and I'm trying to design a building, an architect might say, well, Marie, what's your intent? Who's the building for? What is its purpose? What is its identity? I would never actually have an architect say, Marie, we're going to build a building and it's going to exemplify the building codes. I don't even know what that means. What, are we going to have a room full of outlets at 1.5 feet off the ground? In the same way, it doesn't make sense for a building to say, we're going to have a curriculum that exemplifies the standards. So when we say things like, oh, that's a Common Core curriculum, I don't even know what we're talking about. The Common Core standards are just standards. So they have things like multi-digit addition and subtraction, or identifying the main idea and supporting details. That's not a curriculum. It doesn't tell me what we're reading or the ideas that we're working through. So in that sense, we want to be real clear that we're having conversations about curriculum. What's our purpose? What's our theme? What's the identity of our school? That's where a curriculum starts. And then once we have our building in terms of its design, we go and make sure it meets code. When we're connecting standards, which are the most consistent, and curriculum, which has an insidious design because in some ways it's consistent to the standards, but in other ways it's flexible to the needs of the students and the operational curriculum. Instruction is flexible, completely flexible, in the sense that it is the how teachers and educators are going to make the curriculum accessible to the learner. So in the analogy, when a general contractor agrees to build on a site, every day that general contractor is going to show up there and survey the site and make decisions about exactly what will happen, or building plans, if you will, daily building plans, so that if it rained the night before, even though we intended to pour concrete today, we're not going to, because the concrete won't set. So we make an adjustment, we respond to timely needs. In a similar way, teachers come into the classroom every day, they meet their students, they survey what's going on, and they make lesson plans that respond to the needs of the students and the learning environment that we're in. So in that sense, that flexibility is required for student success, just like the structure and consistency of the standards were required for consistent, observable, measurable success. The last area of our relationships that we want to talk about would be the assessment. So the neat thing about assessment is that it relates individually to all of the compartments that we've just talked about. So assessment evidence of standards, what would that be? Common assessments that are clearly aligned to the targets that come from standards might be found in what we would call common assessments, benchmark assessments, standardized tests. All of these could be classified as assessment evidence of the standards. Assessment evidence of curriculum would often be things like cornerstone assessments, as Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe describe them, or celebrations where students can show off maybe in a showcase portfolio or in some sort of presentation the skills and the content and the thinking that they've been doing curricularly. In many, many cases, these kinds of things connect to not just the standards, but they go above the standards, or they move outside of the realm of the standard expectations. So in many ways, it's those curriculum assessments that show the identity of the school, and in many cases, the growing identities of the learners. Assessment evidence of instruction is not just, oh, here are my lesson plans, instruction happened. We know instruction happened. We're not here to look at the assessment evidence of were there lesson plans. What we want to know is, did the learner engage with the actual experience? So again, when we think about trying to force a child to learn something, it's an awkward experience, and there's no evidence that they engaged. Now, you might have a curriculum that is so aligned, Heidi Hayes Jacobs would want to laminate it. Or you might teach with the passion that would make Marzano want to weep for joy. But if the child does not accept the invitation, if a learner does not engage, then we're not going to get them as far in the content and skills as they could have. That's very important information for us to think about. So when we say assessment evidence of instruction, we're looking for, to what extent did the learner accept the invitation and engage? Formative assessments, as described by Rick Stiggins, gives us that information because it results in a learning plan. As an assessment, it's less interested in the grades and more interested in, to what extent did the learner make a choice and engage, make a commitment, if you will, to the learning. And so we can talk about how these three kinds of assessment information help us understand and reflect on the standards, the curriculum, the instruction, and the assessment story in our buildings.